I knew something was off the second I pulled into my driveway. The woodpile beside my garage, my stacked, neatly cut firewood, was gone. Not a single log remained. I stepped out of my truck, scanning the yard. No sign of a break-in, no trail of splinters leading away. Just gone. I clenched my jaw. That wood wasn't just for my own use, it was my livelihood. I supplied firewood to nearly every home in the neighborhood, including the HOA clubhouse. In winter, they relied on my deliveries to keep their fancy communal fireplace roaring. And now, someone had stolen my entire stockpile. I stormed up to my front door, but before I could even process my next move, I heard the voice that could make any sane man's blood pressure spike. "Mr. Rivers." I turned, already knowing who it was. Naomi Nichols, the HOA president, was marching toward me, her heels clicking against the pavement like an executioner's drum. She was in her usual power stance, arms crossed, expression smug as ever. "Naomi," I said, my voice flat. "I assume you know something about my missing firewood." Her smile was infuriating. "Oh, that? Yes, we repurposed it for a more community-friendly use. It was an eyesore, you see. Just sitting there, cluttering your yard." She waved dismissively. "So, we moved it to the clubhouse. It looks much better there, don't you think?" I gritted my teeth. "You stole my firewood." She scoffed. "Stole? Please. It was unclaimed property, practically a nuisance. And now it's serving a decorative purpose, stacked beautifully by the clubhouse fireplace for an authentic rustic feel." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. That wood wasn't decorative. It was my business inventory. I supply the neighborhood with firewood for the winter, including the clubhouse. Naomi blinked, clearly not expecting that. But she recovered fast. "Well, then, think of it as an advance donation. It's for the good of the community, Oscar." "You wouldn't want to be seen as selfish, would you?" I exhaled slowly, fists clenching. "You expect me to just let this go?" She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "I don't see what the big deal is. If you really need more, you can always chop more, can't you? It's just wood. Just wood." I stared at her, barely believing the audacity. That firewood had taken me months to cut, season, and stack. And now, she'd taken it without asking, without paying, and had the nerve to act like I should be grateful. I forced a smile. "All right, Naomi. If that's how you want to play this, fine. But don't come knocking when the clubhouse runs out of firewood this winter." She laughed, waving me off. "Oh, please. We'll manage. Anyway, do try to keep your yard tidier in the future. The HOA has standards, after all." With that, she strutted off, leaving me fuming on my doorstep. She had no idea what she'd just done. The next morning, I woke up early, still fuming over what had happened. I wasn't about to let this slide. Naomi and her HOA cronies had no right to take my firewood, and I had every intention of making them regret it. But I knew charging in with my anger blazing wouldn't get me anywhere. No, I needed a plan. A smart one. I started by making a few phone calls. First, I reached out to my regular customers in the neighborhood, the folks who depended on my firewood to keep their homes warm. Most of them had prepaid for their winter supply, and when I explained what had happened, the outrage was immediate. Families who had already scheduled their deliveries were now looking at an empty stockpile, all because the HOA had decided to redecorate with my hard work. Next, I called my lawyer. His name was Carl, a no-nonsense guy who had helped me out of a zoning dispute a few years back. I laid out the situation, and he didn't hesitate. This wasn't just a case of petty HOA overreach, it was theft, plain and simple. He assured me that I had legal grounds to demand either full restitution or the immediate return of my property. Feeling more in control, I drove over to the clubhouse. The moment I stepped inside, the smell of my own firewood hit me. There it was, stacked neatly against the brick fireplace, just as Naomi had described. Several HOA board members were lounging around, sipping coffee and chatting like they hadn't just helped themselves to my inventory. I walked right up to the display, running my fingers over the logs. I knew these pieces like the back of my hand. Each one had been split, seasoned, and stacked by me personally. And now, these people were treating it like decoration. Naomi appeared from a side office, clearly surprised to see me. She recovered quickly, putting on that same patronizing expression she always did when she thought she had the upper hand. Before she could speak, I cut her off. I wasn't in the mood for games. "You have 24 hours to return every last piece of my firewood," I said, "or you'll be hearing from my lawyer." Her eyes widened for just a fraction of a second before she forced a laugh. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but Naomi kept up the act. "Now, Oscar," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "There's no need for legal threats. It's already being put to good use here. And really, do you think a judge would waste their time over something as trivial as firewood?" I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough to make sure only she could hear me. "That firewood was prepaid by over a dozen families in this neighborhood," I said. "You didn't just steal from me, you stole from them. And I don't think they'll be too happy when they find out." Naomi's smile faltered, just a bit. I straightened up. "You have until tomorrow morning to return it all. If you don't, I'll be filing a police report. And trust me, this isn't going to go away quietly." Without waiting for her response, I turned and walked out. I had said my piece. Now, I just had to wait and see what she would do. That night, I had a few neighbors over at my place. Word had spread fast about what happened, and people were furious. Some had already tried calling Naomi themselves, only to get brushed off with vague excuses. One of the older residents, Mr. Thompson, shook his head in disgust. "She's been pushing her luck for years, but this is outright theft." A younger couple, the Parkers, chimed in. "We paid for our firewood months ago," Mr. Parker said. "She had no right to take it. If she doesn't return it, we should all file complaints." That was exactly what I had hoped to hear. If enough people stood up together, Naomi wouldn't be able to ignore us. By the time morning came, I was ready. I drove back to the clubhouse, half expecting to find my firewood neatly stacked outside, a reluctant surrender from Naomi. But when I arrived, nothing had changed. The logs were still inside, and Naomi was nowhere to be seen. I took out my phone and made good on my promise. First, I called the police. Then, I called Carl. By the afternoon, Naomi's smug confidence was starting to crack. A police officer arrived at the clubhouse, and I explained everything. The officer took notes, asked a few questions, then went inside to speak to Naomi. It didn't take long for her to realize she was in trouble. The HOA had no legal right to take my property, and now that I had involved law enforcement, she couldn't just brush it aside. When she finally stepped out of the clubhouse, her usual arrogance was gone. For the first time, she looked genuinely concerned. She tried to smooth things over, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But the officer wasn't having it. He made it clear that if the firewood wasn't returned immediately, charges could be filed. By the end of the day, my firewood was back where it belonged. Naomi didn't apologize, of course. She just acted like the whole thing had been a minor inconvenience. But the damage to her reputation was done. The neighborhood had seen her for what she truly was, a manipulative, power-hungry leader who thought she was above the rules. And now, people were starting to push back. As I stacked the last of my reclaimed firewood back in its proper place, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few days were tense. Naomi had been forced to return my firewood, but she was far from done making my life miserable. I could feel the shift in the neighborhood. People were talking, and for once, it wasn't in hushed tones of fear. My confrontation with her had emboldened the residents, and she knew it. That made her desperate. I saw the retaliation coming before it even hit. A notice was taped to my door that morning, stamped with the HOA's official letterhead. A fine $500 for unauthorized storage of commercial materials on residential property. I read it twice, then let out a dry laugh. She was trying to come after me with made-up violations. The firewood had always been there, and it had never been a problem until now. I wasn't about to let it slide. I grabbed the paper and drove straight to the HOA office, a small but unnecessarily lavish building near the entrance of the neighborhood. Naomi was at her desk when I walked in, pretending to be busy with paperwork. Without a word, I placed the fine on her desk. She slowly looked up, feigning indifference. She tapped the paper with a manicured nail. "I see you've received your notice." I crossed my arms. "Funny how my firewood was never an issue until you took it and got caught." She didn't blink. "The HOA board reviewed the guidelines and determined that your large stockpile was in violation of community standards. We have rules, Oscar. You should be grateful we didn't issue a larger fine." I could see what she was doing, trying to push me into a corner, make me feel like I had no choice but to comply. But I wasn't playing her game. I leaned in slightly. "You and I both know this is retaliation. And retaliation is illegal." She gave a tight smile, but her fingers curled slightly around the edge of the paper. "You're free to appeal the fine through the proper channels." I knew what that meant: weeks of delays, endless paperwork, and a board stacked with her loyalists who would deny my appeal without a second thought. Instead, I pulled out my phone and placed it on her desk, screen facing up. Already spoke to my lawyer. I've got documentation showing my firewood has been here for years without issue. If you refuse to revoke this fine, we can take it to court. For the first time, I saw a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't expecting me to fight back this aggressively. I pushed a little further. And while we're at it, I've been looking into the HOA's financials. Seems like the clubhouse firewood budget has been suspiciously low for the past 2 years. Almost like someone's been skimming costs and covering it up. Her face paled just a fraction, but she quickly masked it. That's absurd. I shrugged. Maybe. But I've got people interested in taking a closer look. There was a long silence. Finally, she snatched the fine off the desk, crumpling it slightly in her grip. I'll have the board review it again. I gave a short nod. You do that. I walked out without another word. I knew I'd won this round, but Naomi wasn't the type to back down quietly. The next evening, I noticed something strange. A few of my neighbors had gathered near the clubhouse, whispering amongst themselves. When I approached, they fell silent, looking uneasy. Mr. Parker finally spoke. Oscar, did you hear what Naomi's planning? I frowned. No. What now? She's proposing a new rule at the next HOA meeting. A ban on storing excessive firewood on personal property. My jaw tightened. She was trying to change the rules just to target me. She's claiming it's about aesthetics, Mrs. Parker added. Says it makes the neighborhood look unkempt. I exhaled slowly. Naomi wasn't just retaliating, she was trying to shut down my business entirely. I wasn't going to let that happen. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I pulled records of my firewood sales, compiled statements from neighbors who relied on my supply, and even dug into the HOA's own bylaws. If Naomi wanted a fight, I was going to give her one. The night of the meeting, the community center was packed. More residents had shown up than I'd ever seen before. Naomi sat at the front, flanked by her usual cronies, looking composed but wary. She started the meeting with routine matters, but it was clear everyone was waiting for the real showdown. When she finally brought up her proposed firewood ban, I stood immediately. This proposal is a direct attack on me, I said, my voice clear and firm. Naomi is creating new rules to target a single resident, which is not only unethical, but legally questionable. She lifted her chin. This is about maintaining the beauty of our community, not personal grievances. I pulled out a stack of papers and held them up. Then explained why my firewood has been here for over a decade without issue until now. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I continued. I also have documented proof that multiple families in this neighborhood depend on my firewood to heat their homes in the winter. Are you really going to take that away from them? Naomi's expression tightened. Residents can source firewood elsewhere. I let out a short laugh. You mean they can pay triple the cost elsewhere? Because that's the reality. More voices joined in, this time in agreement. People were fed up. Then I dropped the final bombshell. And if this really isn't personal, Naomi, why is it that the HOA's budget for firewood at the clubhouse has been suspiciously low for years? Almost like someone's been getting it for free. Gasps filled the room. Naomi's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. One of the board members, an older man who had always been quiet, finally spoke. Is this true, Naomi? She stammered, trying to regain control. Of course not. That's ridiculous. I held up a printed spreadsheet. I have the numbers right here. And I'm more than willing to let an auditor take a closer look. The meeting erupted into chaos. People were demanding answers. Residents who had once been too afraid to speak out were now shouting for transparency. The board was flustered, and Naomi looked like she wanted to disappear. By the end of the night, the firewood ban proposal was dead in the water. And Naomi? She was officially under scrutiny. I walked out of that meeting knowing one thing: Naomi's reign over this neighborhood was crumbling. It was only a matter of time before she fell completely. After the HOA meeting, Naomi's grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and she knew it. The firewood ban had been shot down in front of everyone, and the murmurs of an audit into the HOA's finances were growing louder. But if I had learned anything about Naomi, it was that she wouldn't go down without a fight. The very next morning, I found a fresh new violation taped to my door. This time, it was a warning about the height of my backyard fence, claiming it was non-compliant with HOA standards. I wasn't surprised, but I was getting tired of the games. My fence had been the same height for years, and no one had ever said a word about it. I spent the day reinforcing my position. I went down to City Hall to request the original neighborhood blueprints and property regulations, making sure I had every legal document to support my case. While I was there, something else caught my eye. A file containing public HOA financial records from the past decade. I requested copies and took them straight to Carl, my lawyer. We sat in his office, poring over the numbers, and within an hour, we found what I had suspected. Naomi had been manipulating the budget for years. There were discrepancies in maintenance costs, inflated invoices for clubhouse expenses, and most notably, a massive reduction in what should have been spent on firewood. Carl leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the table. There was a gleam in his eye that told me I had something big. If what you're saying is true, Naomi's not just overstepping her authority, she's committing fraud, he said. This could be enough to force a full-scale investigation into the HOA's finances. That was exactly what I needed. That evening, I gathered with a few of my neighbors, including Mr. Parker and Mr. Thompson, and showed them what I had found. Their reactions ranged from disbelief to anger. They had been paying HOA fees for years, trusting that their money was being used for the upkeep of the neighborhood. Now, it was clear that a large chunk of it had been vanishing into Naomi's pocket. Mr. Thompson, usually mild-mannered, clenched his fists. We need to take this to the entire community. She's been stealing from us. I agreed. But first, I needed more proof. Over the next few days, I worked with Carl to draft an official complaint to the city council, detailing the financial irregularities and the abuse of power within the HOA. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was turning against Naomi faster than she could control. People were demanding answers, questioning fines they had paid in the past, and refusing to comply with her arbitrary rules. Then, the final piece of evidence fell into place. One of the former HOA treasurers, a man named Richard who had resigned years ago, reached out to me. He had seen the growing unrest and decided it was time to come clean. Over coffee at a small diner outside the neighborhood, he told me everything. Naomi had pressured him into signing off on false expense reports, claiming they were minor adjustments to keep the budget balanced. When he started asking too many questions, she made his life miserable. She buried him in fines, forced inspections on his property, and even spread rumors that he had mishandled funds. Eventually, he couldn't take it anymore and resigned. I recorded everything he said and had Carl draft an affidavit. This was the nail in the coffin. Armed with solid evidence, I called for an emergency HOA meeting. I made sure everyone in the neighborhood knew what was coming, and by the time the meeting started, the room was packed. Naomi sat at the front with the other board members, but for the first time, she looked nervous. I didn't waste time. I stood up and laid everything out in front of everyone. The financial discrepancies, the fraud, the witness testimony. I passed out copies of the documents, ensuring every resident could see the proof with their own eyes. The room erupted. People were furious, demanding an explanation, calling for Naomi's resignation. She tried to regain control, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that the accusations were baseless. But the evidence was undeniable. Even her most loyal board members were looking at her with suspicion. Then, Mr. Thompson stood up, his voice booming over the crowd. I motioned to remove Naomi Nichols from the HOA board immediately and call for an independent audit of the HOA's finances. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Naomi's face was pale as she tried to protest, but it was over. A vote was held on the spot, and the decision was nearly unanimous. Naomi was officially ousted. In the following weeks, the HOA was restructured. A full audit was conducted, revealing even more financial mismanagement. Naomi faced legal consequences, and the HOA was forced to return thousands of dollars in improperly charged fees to residents. As for me, I went back to my business, my firewood stacked exactly where it belonged. The neighborhood was finally free from Naomi's iron grip, and people were more united than ever. Justice had been served. With Naomi gone, the neighborhood finally had its chance to breathe. The HOA board, now under the leadership of a more level-headed resident named Greg, was scrambling to undo years of her manipulations. The audit was still ongoing, but preliminary findings confirmed what we had suspected. Naomi had been siphoning funds through fabricated expenses and pocketing the difference. Though her removal had been swift, the damage she left behind wasn't so easily erased. The HOA's finances were a mess, and people who had blindly followed her were now struggling to justify their past loyalty. Some residents were angry at themselves for not speaking up sooner. Others were just relieved the nightmare was over. For me, Life should have gone back to normal. My firewood business was secure, and the ridiculous fines Naomi had tried to pin on me had all been revoked. But something still didn't sit right. I had a gut feeling that Naomi wasn't the type to just disappear. She had spent years controlling this neighborhood with an iron grip. She wouldn't just accept her downfall quietly. That suspicion was confirmed when Greg called me one evening. He had been sorting through more of the HOA's documents and had found something troubling. Naomi had quietly pushed through a change to the HOA's bylaws months before she was removed. It allowed the HOA to place liens on properties over unpaid fines without requiring a board vote. Given how many bogus fines she had issued over the years, this meant there were potentially dozens of residents who could unknowingly be at risk of losing their homes. The worst part? Naomi had used this rule to file a lien on my property just days before she was removed. It wasn't valid. Greg assured me they were working to reverse it, but the fact that she had done it at all made one thing clear. She was still trying to sink her claws into the neighborhood. I decided to pay her a visit. Not at her house. She had skipped town after the meeting, likely to avoid the fallout, but at the office of her lawyer, a slimy real estate attorney named Victor Langley. I recognized the name from some of the audit documents. He had handled several of Naomi's more questionable transactions. When I arrived, I didn't bother making an appointment. The receptionist tried to stop me, but I walked past her straight into Langley's office. He was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, a smug look on his face like he had been expecting me. I placed a copy of the fraudulent lien on his desk. He didn't even glance at it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. He told me that Naomi had left town but was still very interested in the affairs of the neighborhood. He said she had legal avenues she could pursue if I tried to cause more trouble for her. It was a veiled threat, but I didn't flinch. I told him that the HOA had already begun the process of reversing the lien and that any further interference on Naomi's part would only add to the growing list of legal troubles she was facing. I made it clear that if she didn't back off, I would personally ensure she was investigated for every single shady deal she had made during her tenure. Langley's smugness faltered. He wasn't expecting me to be this prepared. He tried to brush it off, but I could see the wheels turning in his head. Naomi had overplayed her hand, and now she was scrambling to hold on to any power she had left. I left his office knowing I had rattled them. That was good, but I also knew this wasn't over. Naomi wasn't just going to accept defeat, she was going to find another way to strike back. Over the next few weeks, the audit results were finalized. The findings were worse than anyone expected. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into bogus expenses, and several large payments had been made to a shell company that, upon further digging, was traced back to Naomi herself. The HOA board voted to turn the findings over to law enforcement, and soon after, an official investigation was opened. But Naomi wasn't the only problem. Some of her former allies on the board were scrambling to save themselves. They had enabled her corruption for years, and now they were trying to shift blame. Greg was doing his best to clean house, but the damage ran deep. Meanwhile, I focused on keeping my business running. With winter approaching, firewood demand was increasing, and I had more orders than ever. People trusted me now more than they ever had before, not just as their firewood supplier, but as someone who had stood up for them when it mattered. Then, just as I thought things were finally settling down, I received a letter in the mail. It was from an anonymous sender, but the contents made my blood boil. It was a copy of a contract, one that Naomi had drawn up with a property development firm. The document outlined plans to buy out several homes in the neighborhood, demolish them, and replace them with high-end condos. The kicker? The deal had been set in motion months ago, but Naomi had kept it hidden. She had been planning to sell out the neighborhood all along. I took the contract straight to Greg. He was just as furious as I was. If Naomi had succeeded, she would have gutted the neighborhood, forcing families out of their homes just to turn a profit. We called an emergency meeting. This time, the entire community showed up. People were livid. They had trusted Naomi to manage the HOA, and she had been plotting to sell them out behind their backs. Greg assured everyone that the deal hadn't gone through. Naomi had been removed before she could finalize it. But the fact that she had tried it all was enough to send shockwaves through the room. One by one, residents stood up and voiced their anger. They weren't just angry at Naomi, they were angry at the system that had allowed her to get away with so much for so long. They wanted change. Real change. By the time the meeting ended, a decision had been made. The HOA would be completely restructured. New bylaws would be drafted, ensuring that no single person could ever wield as much power as Naomi had. The community would have real oversight over the board's actions. And as for Naomi, word had spread about the investigation into her financial dealings. She was facing a mountain of legal troubles, and with every new revelation, her chances of escaping unscathed grew slimmer. She had thought she could control everything, that she could take what she wanted and silence anyone who stood in her way. But she had underestimated the people of this neighborhood. She had underestimated me. The fire Naomi had tried to snuff out had only burned brighter. And now, it was her who was left in the cold. With Naomi out of the picture and the HOA in full reform mode, things should have settled down. But the damage she had done wasn't just financial or bureaucratic, it had left deep fractures in the neighborhood's trust. People were still wary, wondering if another Naomi could rise in her place, if the HOA could truly be reformed, or if it was a system designed to fail from the start. Greg and the remaining board members were doing their best to clean house, but resistance lingered. Some of Naomi's old allies had quietly resigned, hoping to avoid further scrutiny. Others were trying to rewrite history, claiming they had been just as much her victims as everyone else. Nobody was buying it. For me, things had taken an unexpected turn. My firewood business was booming. After everything that had happened, people saw me not just as a supplier, but as someone who had stood up for them. Orders came in faster than I could process, and with winter approaching, demand was higher than ever. But something else had been bothering me. The anonymous letter that had exposed Naomi's secret deal with the developers. It had arrived at just the right time with just the right information. And while I was grateful for the tip, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been waiting for the perfect moment to drop that bombshell. I needed to know who had sent it. The envelope had no return address, but the postmark was local. That meant whoever had sent it lived nearby. I started asking around, subtly at first, casual conversations with neighbors, bringing it up like an afterthought. Most people swore they had no idea who could have sent it. Then, late one evening, I got my answer. Richard, the former treasurer who had testified about Naomi's financial fraud, showed up at my house. He looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot as I invited him inside. He didn't waste time. He admitted that he had sent the letter. He had known about Naomi's deal for months, but had been too afraid to speak up. After she forced him out of the HOA, he had kept tabs on her, watching from the sidelines as she tightened her grip on the neighborhood. He had collected evidence, hoping that one day he would have the courage to use it. When I started pushing back against Naomi, he saw his chance. He had sent the letter anonymously, hoping it would give me the leverage I needed to end her reign for good. I thanked him. He had done the right thing, even if it had taken time. But he wasn't convinced. He still felt guilty for not speaking up sooner, for allowing Naomi to go unchecked for as long as she had. I told him the truth. He wasn't the only one who had been afraid. Naomi had ruled with intimidation, and it was only when the community came together that she was finally stopped. With Richard's confession, one final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Naomi had never been as untouchable as she had believed. Her power had come from fear, from people thinking they had no choice but to follow her rules. The moment that illusion was shattered, she had crumbled. The next week, the HOA held another meeting. This time, it wasn't about emergency votes or exposing corruption. It was about rebuilding. The residents gathered, and for the first time in years, real decisions were being made by the community, not forced upon them by a self-serving dictator. Greg proposed a full restructuring of the HOA, starting with term limits for board members. No one would be allowed to hold power indefinitely. Financial transparency measures were put in place, ensuring that all expenses were publicly documented and accessible to residents. People who had once been silent now spoke up, voicing concerns, offering solutions. It wasn't perfect. It would take time to rebuild trust. But for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt like a community again. As the meeting wrapped up, several residents came up to me, thanking me for standing up against Naomi. I told them the truth. I hadn't done it alone. It had taken all of us, pushing back, refusing to be controlled. Winter arrived, and with it, a heavy snowfall that blanketed the neighborhood. But this time, things were different. There was no last-minute panic about firewood shortages. No desperate scrambling to accommodate Naomi's ridiculous demands. People had planned ahead, stocking up early, supporting local suppliers instead of relying on a corrupt system. In the HOA clubhouse, for the first time in years, they actually paid for their firewood. One evening, as I sat on my porch, Watching the snow fall, Greg stopped by. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a formal letter from the HOA, signed by the new board. It was a public acknowledgement of their mistakes, an official revocation of every fine Naomi had ever slapped on me, and a refund for the money she had taken from residents through bogus fees. I didn't need their gratitude, but knowing that things had changed, that people were finally free from Naomi's grip, made it all worth it. The neighborhood had won. And Naomi? Wherever she was, she had lost everything.